Stories of ghosts and hauntings have been around for centuries, and you can find them in almost every culture across the world. But the 19th century stands out as one rife with tales of spirits, poltergeists and ghouls. The 1800s saw the rise of spiritualism and so-called spirit rappings, and the belief that one could talk with the dead was everywhere. Many villages across England had their own spiritualist circles, and it wasn't odd to hear whispers of ghostly activity in your local area. Big houses owned by upper-class Victorians became breeding grounds for tales of creaking floorboards and things that go bump in the night. And stories of headless coachmen and haunted cemeteries became part of rural British life. The story of Borley Rectory begins in the 18th century, and its legacy continues on to this day. It's one of the most pervasive haunted house stories, up there with Amityville and Raham Hall. And through the years, it acted as a beacon for various flim-flam men, all of them drawn to the strange tales told by the inhabitants. But what's the real story behind the supposed most haunted house in England? Let's find out.
The ghost in my house. The ghost of your memory.
The story of Borley Rectory begins with the Bull family, members of which had lived in the local area for over 300 years. Now, staying in the same place might sound strange to some of you, I know it does to me. But I recently did my ancestry, and on both sides of my family, you can trace them back 200 years, and they're all within the same 10-mile radius. So my family aren't very adventurous at all, except for the Scottish side. Anyway, the Bulls held significant power in the local area. They were a big landowner family, and you know how much we love landlords on this channel. The rectory itself was constructed by Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull in 1862. It was to replace an earlier rectory that had been destroyed by fire in 1841. It was surrounded by tall, dark trees, and it was built out of red brick and stone. Some of the windows had bars on them, and the original building had 18 rooms. Henry was described as tall and heavily built. He was a country boy. He loved shooting and hunting, and apparently he'd also been an amateur boxer in his youth, which is one hell of a pastime for a reverend. He fathered 14 children with his wife, Caroline Sarah Bull, and I looked through the newspaper archives while I was researching this video, and there's a period of a few years where it's like a non-stop baby factory. Poor Caroline. Because of all these babies, he added an entirely new wing onto the rectory, which is wild to me because there's already bloody 18 rooms. How many kids are you going to have? In the 19th century, many towns and villages were rife with supernatural rumours. There was no Netflix or YouTube to get your fix of strange, spooky stories, and thus people had to make up their own forms of entertainment, usually by way of urban legends that concerned headless coachmen and ghostly apparitions that could only be seen late at night. And Borley wasn't immune to these terrifying tales. One of the most prominent was a tale that supposedly dated all the way back to 1362. It claimed that a monk from a nearby monastery had been having an affair with a nun from a convent that was said to have stood near the site occupied by Borley Rectory. There were multiple iterations of this urban legend, with some claiming that the nun was planning to run away with the monk, and that they'd even arranged a coach to take them away from the Borley area. They ended up being caught, and the monk was hanged. The coachmen that were there to take them away were beheaded, and the nun was sealed into the walls of the nunnery. She was walled. Can you imagine that? You just want to run away with the monk that you love, and then you're bricked up, never to be seen again. It's not very godly behaviour, is it? And also, I love how the worst punishment is reserved for the woman. Now, there's zero evidence to prove this legend, and that's kind of significant because the religious records in the medieval period were actually quite good, and there is zero record of a monastery or a convent in Borley. So where did the story come from? Well, according to research by local historian Andrew Clark, there appear to have been a number of inspirations, from Walter Scott's Marmion, which was a poem published in 1808 where a nun was walled up in a convent for breaking her vows, to decidedly more local stories. In 1850, in the parish of Glemsford, just 4 miles from Borley, the skeletons of a male and female were found coffinless, and an article in the Bury and Norwich Post made reference to an ancient site of a monastery in the field in which the bodies were found. Then, in Acton, which is also 4 miles outside of Borley, the Bury and Norwich Post wrote about a headless groom and outrider and 4 spectral horses that would ride through the village at midnight. So basically, it's all the fault of the Bury and Norwich Post writing salacious headlines in the 19th century. There were so many stories about hauntings and ghosts in the 19th century. These were the boom years for spiritualism and belief in poltergeists and the occult, and the Bull family were most likely aware of these urban legends and village whispers, and they were imaginative and creative children themselves. They would often visit a church in the nearby village of Great Yeldham, where their father would preach on a Sunday. The rectory in Great Yeldham had its own long history of supposed hauntings, and obviously, if you have impressionable children in a supposedly haunted building, well, you're going to hear some wild stories, and some of them might just follow you home. Henry Bull died at 59 years old on the 2nd of May 1892 in what would become known as the Blue Room, which was one of the principal bedrooms in the property, also known as room number 6. His son, legally named Henry but preferring the name Harry, took over as rector, and so began a strange new chapter in Borley's history. There are plenty of accounts from various sources that claim to have experienced strange goings-on at Borley Rectory during the later part of the 19th century. However, there's no real record of them until Borley Rectory became famous as a site for hauntings, and that was all thanks to a ghostly encounter that the 3 Bull sisters, Ethel, Frida and Mabel, claimed to have had on July 28, 1900. According to Ethel herself,
I was walking round the garden with 2 of my sisters, and they'd been to a garden party and telling me an amusing story that had happened. And then they wondered I didn't take any notice, and they looked down at me, and I said, "Look, there's a nun walking there." And I was terrified, and so were they when they saw her. And it sent cold shivers down our backs, and we simply flew up to the house. And then we saw my eldest sister who was staying with us, and she said, "Oh, I'm not going to be frightened." So she came down, and when she saw the nun, she made to go across the potato bed to meet the nun. And the nun turned and came, as it were, to meet her, and she was seized with panic and simply flew up to the house.
Now, it's important to remember that the Bull sisters never saw a face and merely saw a figure dressed in black. It happened on a late summer evening, and as such, the visibility would have been incredibly poor. Interestingly, Andrew Clark makes a very convincing argument in his essay, The Nun and the Travelling Scissorman, that the figure that the girls saw might have been that of a travelling tradesperson, and he writes that the Borley Road was a popular stopping place for travellers, and that it's much more likely that one of them was using the grounds of the rectory as a shortcut. Either that, or they were interested in digging around in the potato beds. Either way, the sisters were convinced that they had actually seen a nun, and they weren't the only ones. According to Ernest Ambrose, who was an organist at Borley Church and knew the Bull family well,
a young housemaid who had only been at the rectory a short time and had heard no talk of ghosts, told me she came home one evening and in the semi-darkness saw a person dressed as a nun or a nurse standing at the lower garden gate. She approached it and it vanished.
Now again, this housemaid could well have seen a travelling tradesperson, or they could have seen any cloaked figure. Remember, these sightings are happening late in the evening, and it's also important to remember that even if this housemaid had heard nothing of Borley Rectory being haunted, she may well have heard the numerous local legends about the bricked up nun. There are reports of Ethel having seen a dark-clothed man in a tall hat inside the rectory itself. She said that she was woken up by the feeling of someone sitting on her bed, but we'll later come to find that some of these tall tales may have been exaggerated. And it's important to note here that Ethel herself said,
"We lived there for many years. We were a large family, 12 of us in fact, and we were happy, and nothing happened. We never knew anything about the nun. And then the noises in the house. There were a few noises, but they never disturbed us, We never thought anything of it.
That is, until the midsummer appearance of the ghostly nun, just a few years after Harry took over as rector. People describe Harry Bull as having spiritualist views, and they claim that he was interested in ghosts and hauntings, but it's hard to prove that with zero evidence. One of his brothers, Gerald Bull, claimed that the entire thing was the product of feminine imagination, which is very much giving the same energy as that one Tory that got on the TV recently and claimed that he didn't need to have the heating on because he's a hot-blooded male.
I'm a hot-blooded male. Females in my house like to have the heating on.
A real man doesn't need heating, and he also doesn't believe in ghosts. Another brother, Walter Bull, was a little less sexist and claimed that nothing out of the ordinary ever happened at Borley. But that doesn't mean that the village was devoid of paranormal whispers. According to Ernest Ambrose,
ghosts and house haunts were, however, often talked of and believed in when I was a boy. People believed explicitly in evil spirits and in apparitions, and most certainly the devil. Children were often threatened with the devil. You mightn't do that, do the devil get you? Spirits of good and evil were considered a natural part of everyday life, and heaven and hell were very real places in minds of ordinary people.
Remember, the Bulls were religious children and Harry was a rector. They were people that, by all accounts, believed in heaven and hell, the devil, demons and evil spirits. So that, combined with the village whispers, created the perfect environment to foster these spooky stories. In 1911, Harry Bull married the widow of the late Mr. Harold Brackbury. Her name was Ivy, and they moved across the road to the Borley place, while the sisters remained at the rectory with their mother. Just 3 years later, in 1914, Caroline Sarah Bull, the mother of the Bull children, died at age 77 in the Blue Room, the same room that Henry had passed in. The Bull sisters were not huge fans of Harry's new wife. The story goes that Caroline had left the inheritance to the Bull brothers because obviously women can't be trusted with the family finances. I mean, can you imagine the scandal? A woman having control over money? Absolutely not. Now, Harry wanted to pass this inheritance over to his wife, and the sisters were like, hang on a minute, Harry, what about us? Giving our bloody money away to your new wife? This led to a little bit of a rift between the Bull sisters and Harry's new wife, and he supposedly told him, don't worry about it, babes, I've got you, I'll sort it out. The will's going to be fine, don't worry. Harry moved back to the rectory in 1920 with his wife, but just 7 short years later, Harry passed away in the Blue Room. What is going on with this bloody room? I'd have it locked and sealed up at this point. I'd have it bricked up like they did with the nun. I wouldn't be having it. Now, obviously, they all died in there because it was one of the 2 main bedrooms, and most likely all 3 of the Bulls to die in that room died in bed. After Harry's death, it was revealed that he had actually never changed his will, and Ivy got everything, and the sisters were pissed. They began to concoct a story amongst themselves, one that implicated Ivy in the death of their brother. Alongside the family drama, they were also tasked with installing a new rector at Borley. The story goes that they offered it to at least 12 reverends who all rejected the offer outright. It was a cold and depressing house. There's no heating, the only water comes from a well, and apparently the Bulls had let things go. There were reports of rat infestations, which is not what you want when you're moving into a new house. It was Reverend Eric Smith, the 13th Reverend to be approached, that finally took up residency at Borley, and the story of England's most haunted house was only just getting started.
I always feel like somebody's watching me, and I have no privacy.
On the 2nd of October 1928, Reverend Eric Smith and his wife Mabel moved into Borley Rectory. They'd previously lived in Calcutta, but moved back to England due to Mabel's poor health, and they knew nothing of the rectory before they moved in. So, when they arrived and saw a huge decaying house with an arduous plumbing system and a decrepit roof, they started to question their decision. To actually get water into the rectory, you'd have to go outside to the well that was in the middle of the courtyard. It had a pump that you would have to use to send the water all the way up to the collection tank in the attic of the building, which then sent it through the taps in the house. The rectory was often left unlocked, and locals would come in to use the toilet, as well as some of the empty rooms in the house, and I'll let you use your imagination as to what they were getting up to in there. Now, Mabel was suffering from poor health. She was probably thinking that she was going to move into some nice country home for a bit of rest and relaxation, only to find a scene out of bloody Grey Gardens. I mean, I don't know about Mabel, but I would be absolutely fuming. The Bulls couldn't stay away from the rectory either, and the sisters made sure that the Smiths were brought up to speed on all of the ghostly happenings. They were obviously incredibly keen to share their version of events, that their late brother had been murdered by none other than his own wife to secure their inheritance. Mabel was supposedly so taken with this story that she had begun working on a book titled Murder at the Parsonage, although I'm not 100% clear when she actually started writing it. But this, combined with the urban legends that spread like wildfire throughout villages like Borley, bothered Mabel so much that she decided to write a letter to the Daily Mirror in June 1929, asking if they could provide her with the address for the Society of Psychical Research. Now, some researchers of Borley Rectory will claim that the Smiths had their own paranormal experiences, and if the later accounts in the Daily Mirror and in books published by a man that we'll come on to are true, then they most definitely did. There are even accounts of Mabel finding a human skull wrapped in brown paper in a cupboard, but it is almost impossible to verify whether or not that actually happened. What we do know is that the Daily Mirror jumped at the chance to report on a possible ghost story, and instead of merely passing on an address, they sent a reporter to Borley to uncover the mysterious goings-on. The first article appeared on June 10th, 1929. It was titled Ghost Visits to a Rectory, and it relayed the local stories of headless coachmen and the bricked-up nun. They also claimed that the Smiths brought a servant girl from London to the property, and she quit after just 2 days because she was so terrified. The next day, another article appeared with the headline Mystery Light in Haunted Wood, and the reporter had claimed to have completed a vigil of several hours in the haunted wood at the back of Borley Rectory, and he claims to have seen a mysterious light in a disused part of the house, as well as a white figure flitting about in the gloom, although she had just turned out to be the rectory maid, which is interesting to me. Could it be that the Smiths had asked their own maid to go and flit about while the reporter was outside watching? If they really wanted to promote this story of murder at Borley Rectory, what better way than to have the national press believing that the property was rife with ghosts? This is all, of course, speculation, but it is a much more believable and simple story than something paranormal. And according to some reports, the maid, Mary Pearson, later admitted to putting her apron over her head as a prank and running around in the garden. On June 11th, a man named Harry Price was having lunch with a friend in South Kensington when he received a telephone call from the editor of the Daily Mirror. Price was a psychic researcher who had become relatively well known for debunking spiritualists, and while some would call him one of the most fascinating and storm-provoking figures in psychical research, others would call him a supreme bluffer and a hedonistic conman. Interestingly, he was also the first chairman of the National Film Library, which would eventually become the BFI National Archive. Whatever you think of Harry Price, he was an incredibly interesting man who had a long and strange career in the world of the paranormal. But it was Borley Rectory that was to become one of his most well-publicised cases. The editor of the Daily Mirror relayed these stories that their journalist had been working on and asked if Harry would like to visit and take charge of the case. Obviously, Harry jumped at the chance to be involved, and he made arrangements to visit Borley the next day with his secretary, Lucy Kay. He packed his ghost hunter's kit, which included, among other things, a bowl of mercury and soft felt overshoes designed for creeping. They both arrived in Borley around midday on Wednesday the 12th of June, and the Reverend and Mabel welcomed them with lunch. According to various later accounts, at this lunch a salt and pepper shaker shot across the table, and Harry Price made a joke about it being ghosts. However, later on, the maid, Mary Pearson, would claim that she saw Harry throw the shaker across the table. Harry claimed that the Smiths told him all about their experiences at the rectory over lunch, such as hearing distant whispers and a woman's voice muttering, "Don't, Carlos, don't," along with mysterious bell ringing and footsteps throughout the house. The Smiths would later go on to contradict all of this, and that's what makes Borley such a fascinating and frustrating case to research. This These people have bloody contradicted themselves left, right and centre. Also over lunch, a dinner guest claimed that the water in her glass turned to ink, a conjuring trick most likely done by Harry Price, who had been part of the magic circle and had a keen interest in sleight of hand tricks. It's hard to discern what Harry Price was actually told over the dinner table, but it was most likely a hodgepodge of urban legends and stories from the Ball sisters. He said,
I found the Smiths very intelligent, delightful and much-travelled people, who were, like myself, utterly sceptical in regard to spirits.
Harry Price began to investigate the house, and he interviewed some of the staff, including the Smiths' maid, Mary Pearson. She claimed,
I've seen the figure of a nun on several occasions recently, and I've also observed a very old-fashioned coach on the lawn driven by brown horses. It was generally between 9:30 and 10 o'clock at night, and the light was so clear that I caught a glimpse of the nun leaning over a gate near the rectory, a short distance from where I was standing. A little later, when I went to my bedroom and looked out of the window, I distinctly saw a coach on the lawn driven by 2 headless men. Another time, when walking up the roadway to the rectory with a friend, I saw the figure of a nun in a kneeling posture on the steps leading to the church. My friend was so frightened that she fainted and had to be carried back to the rectory until she recovered.
Now, this is a very fantastical account, and I'm not saying that she's making it up. A lot of people do see strange things late at night that seemingly can't be explained. She may well have completely believed in what she saw, and this story of the headless coachman and the nuns and all of that jazz. Or she might just be making it all up. Who am I to say? According to Harry Price, during the latter part of the evening, 2 of the Ball sisters had come over to the rectory to meet him, and they had decided to perform a late-night séance in the Blue Room. It's not far-fetched to suggest that the séance was the Ball sisters' suggestion. It was the perfect opportunity to relay to Harry Price the story of their brother's supposed murder. Now, not surprisingly, every single account of this séance is rife with contradictions. Mr. Wall, the journalist from the Daily Mirror, claimed that all of them, including the rector and his wife, questioned the spirit and received answers in the form of raps on the back of a wooden framed mirror. However, the Smiths supposedly only arrived towards the end of the séance to drop off some refreshments and were supposedly horrified at the line of questioning and demanded an end to the entire thing. Lucy Kay claimed that the séance only stopped when the rapping became faint and both her and Harry were absolutely cream crackered. I'm teaching the Americans some Cockney rhyming slang today. It means knackered. Cream crackered, knackered. The spirit that was supposedly rapping on the back of the mirror was none other than Reverend Harry Bull, not the ghostly nun or the monk or the headless coachman. And Lucy claimed that he was asking for help with his will, you know, the one that he wrote himself and the one that the sisters didn't like. The séance was brought to a climax when a bar of soap was lifted and thrown into a jug on the floor, causing a dent in the soap. That, combined with the raps on the wooden mirror, is clear evidence of ghostly activity, right? Well, Andrew Clark puts the raps down to changes in humidity due to the paraffin lamp that was lighting the room. He notes that in Harry Price's account that they're constantly turning this lamp on and off. When they turn it off, the raps stop, but when they relight it, the raps start again. And this can be explained by the hot air from the lamp causing the wooden frame of the mirror to expand. But what of the soap? Could there be an explanation for that too? We already know that the maid claims to have seen Harry Price throw a salt shaker across the table at lunch. And on Friday the 14th of June, the Daily Mirror published an article by Mr. Wall, who claimed to have been walking down the stairs at Borley when a vase flew past his head and shattered. When he looked behind him, the only person there was Harry Price. Later on in 1929, Harry would visit with Charles Sutton, a reporter from the Daily Mail, who went on to claim that he was hit in the head by a pebble that Harry Price had thrown. He said, "The act of a half-brick flying down the staircase impelled me to drop the hurricane lamp I was carrying, seize Harry Price and accuse him of having thrown it. I found 2 of his coat pockets full of stones, but I did not see him throw the half-brick that went down the staircase." Harry Price believers will clearly not be satisfied with these more earthly explanations that point to him being responsible for the phenomena at Borley. But they're a lot more believable than the ghost of Harry Bull being pissed about the will that he himself wrote. The day after the séance, Harry and Lucy hot footed it over to nearby Sudbury to visit the Ball sisters, where they relayed their earlier experiences of living in the rectory. And they also provided him with the address of their former gardener, a Mr. Edward Cooper, who claimed that while living in the cottage that adjoined the rectory, he constantly heard the pattering of feet. Now, given what we know about how the village folk used Borley Rectory, the sounds of pattering feet don't seem all that scary. Edward also claimed to have seen a horse and carriage on the nearby road. However, he would also go on to say that Harry Price's account was a little muddled, and he most likely just saw a regular horse and carriage. After his interviews, Price returned to Borley, where he stayed until the Friday. Although he had organised for a formal séance that evening, he didn't attend it, but he did leave behind his secretary Lucy Kay, and he sent 2 mediums from London. However, this séance was to prove fruitless, and Mr. Wall would write the next day in the Daily Mirror that the shy ghost of Borley Rectory had declined to reveal itself. It almost seemed as though as soon as Harry Price left the building, so did the ghosts. The Smiths even said,
When Mr. Price arrived to investigate, immediately we were astonished at an onset of phenomena. Bangs, clattering, keys thrown, etc. We couldn't help being led to suppose that he himself was producing some of the effects.
All of this made for extremely entertaining reading in the Daily Mirror, and the back-to-back daily articles reached a huge audience with a hunger for paranormal stories. Masses of people descended upon the village, stomping through the flower beds to peep through the windows, desperate to catch a glimpse at the so-called ghosts. The Smiths eventually left Borley Rectory on the 14th of July 1929, no longer willing to put up with villagers using their home as a hookup spot, as well as growing increasingly frustrated at the lack of any decent plumbing. I don't blame them for leaving. If I had people creeping in my house doing God knows what, I'd be out of there too. But Harry Price didn't leave the Borley story alone, and he visited at least twice after the Smiths left. However, he ceased visiting in the winter, coincidentally after his visit where Charles Sutton found his coat pockets filled with stones. Could it be that he was worried about being exposed? Had he just grown tired of the Borley story? Or was it the harsh conditions of winter that drove him away? Either way, his interest was to be ignited once more when he received an unannounced visit to his South Kensington offices by 2 old acquaintances on September 29th, 1931. On October 16th, 1930, a new family moved into the rectory. Reverend Lionel Foyster was a first cousin of the Bulls, and he and his wife Marianne had recently come back to the UK from Canada. The story of Lionel and Marianne is incredibly dramatic and soap opera-like. To give you a brief rundown, Lionel had actually baptised Marianne when she was a child. Now, I know it's the 1930s, but surely that must have raised some eyebrows back then. Marianne was born in 1899 in Ireland, and she had actually married an Englishman and had a child by him when she was very young. They named the baby Ian. The man's mother demanded that he move back to England, and there was some drama going on between this man, his mum, and Marianne. So Marianne's dad had a deed drawn up to arrange a legal separation. And after that, she started communicating with Lionel via letter, who was living in Canada at the time, and the two of them became incredibly close, culminating in Lionel inviting Marianne to come and share his life in Canada. It's just kind of gross. I mean, like, he baptised her as a child and now they're getting married. It's serious Woody Allen vibes. While living in Canada, the Foysters lived close to Amherst, which was the location for the Great Amherst Mystery, basically an over-exaggerated tale of poltergeist activity. Walter Hubble wrote a book about it in 1888 and it sold very well, so you could make the case that the Foysters were aware of paranormal stories and ghostly activity. Ian, Marianne's son, remained in Ireland where he was raised by her parents. And while in Canada, the Foysters adopted a young girl named Adelaide and brought her to England with them. They were supposedly incredibly fond of children, despite not having any of their own. At Borley, Marianne had a lot of children in the house, and villagers reported that there were many babies that had been taken in. When people write about Marianne, it most often has a misogynistic undertone to it. She's described as flirtatious flirtatious and lively, hysterical and whimsical. You have to remember that Marianne was young. She was barely in her 20s when she began a relationship with the man that baptised her, and she was only in her 30s at Borley, stuck in an incredibly isolated village in a huge house with not much to do. At Borley, Marianne noticed an advert in the Times, a young boy looking for a home, because that's what they did back then, apparently, advertise children like unwanted dogs. They got in contact with the father, a man named Frank Peerless or Francois de Arles, who's a man of many names. Andrew Clark calls him a Cockney fantasist, and with all the descriptions of Frank, I can't help but envision a man that looks somewhat like Oliver Reed's version of Bill Sykes. He's described as dark, short and stout. He rode a motorbike and told tall tales about working for the French Secret Service and being involved in the movies. The child, Douglas, came to live with the Foysters in March 1931, and Frank occasionally visited at the weekends to do odd jobs. He usually stayed in the rectory cottage. While Marianne's relationship with her husband was mostly platonic, her relationship with Frank was anything but, and they soon began an affair. Interestingly, around the same time, Lionel began busying himself writing what he called a diary of occurrences, detailing ghostly goings-on at the rectory. The Foysters were very much aware of the legacy of Borley Rectory. Lionel was a cousin of the Bulls, so he must have heard all about Harry's murder and the nun and all of that stuff. And the subconscious can be incredibly powerful. But some of these diary entries were fabricated. For instance, he claimed that Marianne actually saw the ghost of Harry Bull, something that she would later deny. The encounters were good-spirited to begin with, but things started to take a somewhat sinister turn when Marianne claimed to be hit with a terrific blow to the eye, which almost stunned her, and later a hammer would supposedly fly across the room, landing dangerously close to Marianne. It's impossible to say whether these incidents actually happened. In later life, Marianne would deny almost all of it. In the spring of 1931, writing began to appear on the walls of Borley Rectory. Lionel would write in his recollections that Marianne's name was written on various scraps of paper, and he claims to have shown these writings to a Lady Whitehouse, the wife of the church warden. On the walls, the words "Marianne, please help, get" would appear, and the Foysters claimed to write back, trying to communicate with whoever was trying to get in touch. Many would claim that Adelaide was an intense scribbler and that she had a thing for scrawling on the walls. And it's true that these wall writings began with simple loops and scribbles. It's also important to remember that Frank's son Douglas was also in the house. Could it be that an adult had seen the scribbles of a child on the wall and gotten the bright idea to fake ghostly messages? Marianne would claim that the writing seemed to appear at the same time as a new face at Borley, a Mr. Edwin Whitehouse. He was the nephew of the church warden, and he was suffering from PTSD from World War I, as well as being deeply fascinated with spiritualism and religion. When they were showing him around the house in June 1931, they saw more writing on the wall that read, "Get light mass and prayers here." Was it possible that Edwin had faked the wall writings himself? Well, no, because almost all of them appeared on the walls before he even got to Borley, unless he was sneaking around with nobody noticing. The writing was most likely done by Marianne. The scrawls on the wall were incredibly similar to her own handwriting. And a ghost in the house is very convenient for when you're sneaking around late at night with Frank and need something to blame the footsteps on. On Edwin's first visit to the rectory, he tells Lionel that if anything else untoward happens, he's to send for him immediately. Edwin really wants to be involved in this story. He wants to exorcise this ghost out of Borley once and for all. The day after his visit, Marianne was taken ill and prescribed bed rest. She sat up in the spare bedroom on a flimsy jerry bed, which had been known to collapse several times in the past. The morning after Marianne's night in the spare room, she tells Lionel that she had heard footsteps all night, as well as taps, and the first thing Lionel does is go and send for Edwin. By the time he gets back, he finds that one of the bedrooms has been completely ransacked. There's stuff everywhere, and Edwin, having received the message, shows up and claims to have seen almost the entire contents of a bedroom, adjoining the blue room and overlooking the lawn, were scattered on the main staircase and lower floor. Shoes, bedclothes, brushes, clothes of all kind and other odds and ends were lying about the place. Higgledy-piggledy. Edwin then decides to visit Marianne on her sickbed. They talk for a while when he suddenly sees her startle, and then a brass stiletto lands in his lap. Now, he obviously thinks that there's a ghostly explanation for it, and Marianne denies doing it. But what's more likely? He even knows that she made a sudden movement, and then the object appeared. He then leaves the room and begins to go downstairs when he hears Marianne shrieking, and both him and Lionel rush to her aid and find her on the floor with the mattress on top of her, like she'd been turfed out of the bed. Marianne claimed that she'd been pushed, but we know that the bed that she was on was unstable, and Andrew Clark claims that the most likely explanation was that she had leapt quickly from the bed and it had collapsed. There was obviously a lot going on at the rectory on this day, and Edwin's aunt and uncle arrived to tell the Foysters that they could come and stay with them at nearby Arthur Hall. Desperate to get out of the so-called haunted house, they accepted, and they stayed at Arthur Hall for a while. During the summer of 1931, various investigators came and went from Borley, most of them convinced that Marianne herself was responsible for the phenomena. Sir John Braithwaite came and held a seance there, and allegedly pulled Lionel aside and told him that his wife was hysterical. At some point, Lionel or Marianne must have informed the Ball sisters of everything that had been going down, which led to Ethel visiting Harry Price in Kensington on September 29th, where she urged him to come back and visit the rectory. Just a few days after that visit, Harry received a letter from Lionel inviting him to the rectory and also offering him a copy of his diary of occurrences. Harry was obviously keen to get his grubby mitts on it, and he actually never gave it back, but it didn't really matter because Lionel had his sights set on writing a new account, a fictionalised version titled 15 Months in a Haunted House. Just 4 days before Harry Price's visit, the Society for Psychical Research came to the rectory and decided that the trouble was down to a human agency, and William Salter pulled the Foysters aside and warned them against Harry Price's involvement. Neither of them paid much attention, because on October 13th, Harry Price arrived from London with 2 women from the National Laboratory of Psychical Research and his newest secretary. They met with Lionel and Marianne, and the next day they had lunch, bringing a hamper with them. Not surprisingly, Harry Price pulls his ink trick again, the one where the ink appears in the glass of water. Although, according to Harry, Marianne had been responsible, not him, not the guy that's got a track record of doing this before. Honestly, there's so many untrustworthy people in this story that it's almost impossible to keep up. At around 9:30 p.m, Marianne isn't feeling well again, so she retires to bed, and not soon after do they hear a smash in the hallway. It was the sound of a bottle being thrown down the stairs. Now, obviously, they all rush in to check on Marianne, and she's apparently fast asleep, but the poltergeist activity is just getting started. Bells begin to ring throughout the house, along with pebbles flying down the stairs, and we know how much Harry Price loves a good pebble. Later in the evening, Lionel claims to have taken Marianne a cup of tea, only when he got to the bedroom, all of the doors were locked, and they only opened after Lionel recited the Lord's Prayer. Harry Price would write that every incident appeared to happen with Marianne out of sight, and I'm not sure if he actually knew about the presence of Frank. It's not confirmed that he was there that night, but it wouldn't have been unusual. The next morning, Harry confronts the Foysters with his theory that Marianne is responsible for almost all of this new activity at Borley, and unsurprisingly, they both denied it. Marianne was pissed. This bloody bloke coming into her house and accusing her of being a fake, much like all of the other investigators that have come into her house and accused her of being a fake. Now, Lionel persuaded Harry to spend one more night, suggesting that they have everyone confined to one room, and Harry agreed. That night, with Marianne under their watch, they heard bell ringing, which could easily have been Frank or any of the children. The next day, Marianne told Harry not to return, but he did make at least one more visit to Borley while the Foysters were living there, and on this visit he inspected the series of wall writings, not surprisingly putting them down to Marianne. Later on, she would claim that things always happened when Frank was around, and Frank made some pretty wild claims himself, like the time that he claimed to have fought a ghost in his room and ended up with a black eye, although some put this down to a domestic dispute between him and Marianne. 1932 saw the arrival of the Mark Tays Spiritualist Circle at Borley Rectory. They were a local group run by Mr. and Mrs. Warren, who also ran the local village shop in Mark Tays. They performed a series of seances in early January, and they brought in the medium Guy Lestrange, who would later write a highly embellished account of an evening at Borley, with glass smashing and Marianne floating around the house in a see-through nightdress, seemingly in a trance. Things came to a head on January 23rd. The circle wanted to materialise the spirits and deal with them one at a time, but they were eventually talked out of this by Guy. That night, they heard bottles being thrown down the back stairs. And at one point, Guy claimed to have had a long conversation with a tearful Marianne. The circle reported that there was nervous tension throughout the night. And it's kind of obvious that Frank was in the house and that he was the one playing tricks. Andrew Clark writes that Frank would have been able to access the house via the cellar. And as for the bottles being thrown,
if exploding bottles happened on the back stairs off the kitchen passage, they could have been conveniently thrown, one in each hand, from just outside the cellar door. The cellars had an infinite supply of wine bottles. If they happened on the servants' staircase, then one would be able to engineer the entire effect by tossing bottles, one in each hand, from the attics above or through the first floor window in the courtyard.
It's possible that there was tension in the air that night due to Lionel finding out about Marianne's affair, and she ended up kicking the circle out of the rectory. Much later, Frank would admit to causing most of the phenomena himself, and after the visit from the circle, the haunting seemed to stop, but the drama for the Foysters was only just beginning. Once Lionel found out about the affair, they entered into what would now be described as a non-monogamous relationship. Marianne and Frank ended up moving to London and opening a flower shop. But Frank was an absolute bastard. He was blackmailing Marianne with all sorts of threats, and Lionel had to get his cousin involved to finally get rid of him. He died in London in around 1966. Later on, in 1935, Marianne was pregnant with a man named Henry Fisher's child, and they got married, despite her being married to Lionel, who went on to pretend that he was her dad. Honestly, this story is far more interesting than bloody ghosts. They left the rectory that same year, moving to Rendlesham, and Lionel died in 1945 at 67 years old. Marianne later moved to the USA with another husband, a man named Robert O'Neill. A year after vacating the rectory, Harry Price released his book Confessions of a Ghost Hunter, which I actually own, and it's a first edition copy that I found in a charity shop for £15, and I have to say, it absolutely stinks. Every time I open that book, I feel like I'm in Borley Rectory. The rectory itself would remain empty for several years. A new rector took over in March 1936, but he had no interest in living there. And who would blame him, what with all the local legends of ghosts and poltergeists? In May of 1937, the rectory became inhabited again when a new and decidedly different group of tenants began to take over.
He did the monster mash. It was a graveyard smash.
It seems that Harry Price stayed in contact with the Bull sisters, writing to them in 1937 to ask to be put in touch with the new owner of the rectory, Reverend Alfred Henning. He met with Henning on the 19th of May in Borley and arranged a 12-month tenancy of the empty rectory for a bargain price of just 30 quid, which is around 2,200 in today's money. On the 25th of May, Harry took out an advert in the Times. It read,
Haunted House. Responsible persons of leisure and intelligence, intrepid, critical and unbiased, are invited to join rota of observers in a year's night and day investigation of alleged haunted house in home counties. Printed instructions supplied. Scientific training, or ability to operate simple instruments, an advantage. House situated in lonely hamlet. so own car is essential.
The plan was to recruit a ragtag bunch of independent investigators. Instead of Price himself living at Borley, he offered it up to anyone that was interested in the post, therefore securing almost round-the-clock surveillance at the rectory. He supposedly interviewed almost 200 applicants, and I'm not at all surprised. What better escapism from the banality of life than investigating a so-called haunted house? I mean, honestly, if I saw an ad like that, I'd be on the phone immediately. Harry settled on 48 part-time investigators, giving them all a copy of the alleged haunting at Borley Rectory, instructions for observers, a blue book which described the protocol to be observed at Borley, as well as a brief history of previous paranormal events. Some might argue that Price used the power of suggestion by relaying the spooky history of the property, and that by doing this he was trying to influence the amateur ghost hunters from afar. Two of the most prominent of these investigators were Sidney Glanville and Mark Kerr-Pierce, the former of which kept diligent reports on his time at Borley Rectory, eventually gathering them all into what was known as the Locked Book, because it literally had a padlock on it. Each investigator was made to fill out the Haunted House Declaration form, where they would declare that they weren't associated with the press and that they would not photograph the house or lecture on their experiences there. It seemed that Price wanted to keep the Borley story all for himself, and he didn't want his investigators running off to the newspapers. Observers would book their visits with Harry in advance. He would then write to Mr. and Mrs. Arbon, who lived in the rectory cottage, letting them know what visitors to expect. The building was empty for the most part. The library had been converted into a makeshift operations room where the ghost hunters could take some much needed rest and relaxation, because observing at Borley was kind of a drag. The investigators had to take regular tours of the building, keeping an ear out for any unusual activity. And obviously, in an old, empty and somewhat neglected home, you're going to hear creaks in the night. Harry also requested that observers sit in the summer house that was adjacent to the lawn for half an hour before dusk and half an hour after to watch out for the ghostly nun, as well as sitting in the blue room in darkness for at least an hour. So it wasn't really a relaxing retreat. Observers had to sleep on camp beds and use paraffin lamps. It would have been cold and relatively uncomfortable, but these guys were dedicated and they typed up their reports diligently. Sidney Glanville created detailed floor plans of the rectory, and Mark Kerr-Pierce spent a hell of a lot of time there by himself. He took his role very seriously. There were sounds of footsteps and the occasional bell ringing. Observers reported that they got cold chills and the sense that something was wrong, but nothing as intense as the phenomena that the Foysters had experienced. However, Sidney Glanville and his daughter held a series of seances in late 1937 in both the rectory and their own home. They used a planchette, which is a heart-shaped piece of wood with wheels and a pencil holder that faces downwards. It supposedly enables automatic writing, allowing a ghost to take hold of it and spell out their own story. You can see them without the pen holder on Ouija boards, where they supposedly zigzag across the letters on the board to communicate. Through their seance, the Glanvilles claimed to have communicated with a nun that they identified as Marie Lair. She said that she had been murdered in the 17th century by a member of the Waldegrave family. The spirit also told them to look in the well tank in the cellar, and that if they did, they would find the body of a dead child in there. But here's the thing, the well tank was never in the cellar, it was in the attic. Sidney also claimed that through these automatic writing sessions, the spirit prophesied that the rectory would be burned, and under the ruins they would find the bones of a dead person. Now, it's important to remember that the rectory itself had replaced another that was burned down in 1841, and house fires were fairly common, especially with the use of paraffin lamps. Harry Price's tenancy ended on May 19th, 1938, and in the autumn of that year, Harry made a BBC broadcast. He didn't mention Borley by name, but he spoke about the events that had happened there. He was eventually contacted by a man named Captain Gregson, who wrote to say that he had recently purchased Borley Rectory for himself and that he was planning to take up residency in December. He also wrote that he was getting incredibly annoyed at what he called rubberneckers that would come from miles around to see the so-called haunted house. But what Harry Price didn't know was that these rubberneckers were some of the last to see Borley Rectory in all of its haunted glory. On February 27th, 1939, almost 100 years after the original building had been destroyed by fire, Borley Rectory was once again engulfed in flames. Captain Gregson had supposedly been sorting out books when he had accidentally knocked over a paraffin lamp. But here's the thing, he'd bought Borley for a mere £500 and it was actually insured for £3,500. The entire thing was an insurance scam, and I'm not just saying that. The insurance company believed so too. But the fire didn't stop the ghosts, and apparently witnesses saw figures moving among the flames, and so-called cloaked figures had been seen coming out of the rectory while it was on fire. Just 1 year later, Harry Price released his infamous book on Borley. It was titled The Most Haunted House in England, and that moniker has stuck for over 80 years, despite the extreme lack of evidence. In Harry Price's own words, so many people prefer the bunk to the debunk, and I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should believe in ghosts, but I would say that most of the time you're going to be able to find an earthly explanation. In 1943, Harry and Sidney Glanville visited the ruins of the rectory, and they dug up the floor in the cellar, where they made a terrifying discovery.
At a depth of 3 feet, a human jawbone was found, and 5 minutes later, part of a human skull. These were immediately submitted to an eminent pathologist, who described them respectively as the left mandible with 5 teeth and left parietal and temporal bone, both belonging to a woman probably about 30 years of age. The name of this long-dead lady will almost certainly remain an unsolved mystery, but the fact remains, a woman was buried at the foot of the cellar steps, a strange thing with a churchyard only 100 yards away.
The pathologist in question was there with Harry Price and seemed to have a relationship with him. Also present was a gardener named Jackson, who had previously worked as a farm labourer, and as soon as he saw the bones, he immediately declared them to be that of a pig. However, the bones were immediately given to the pathologist, who straight away said, no, definitely human. The locals were also convinced that these were pig bones, and when the Reverend at Borley made clear his intentions to bury the bones in the graveyard, they were pissed. They were like, absolutely not, mate. My bloody ancestors are buried there. You want to bury a pig next to him? Get out. Also, like, where's the rest of the body? It's just a couple of bones, and they immediately think that they found a human. And also, why not get a second opinion on these bones? It all seems a bit fishy to me, like this rush to bury them, and we're never really going to find out whether or not it's a human or a pig. It's deeply sus. Harry Price wrote another book, The End of Borley Rectory, and it was published in 1946. In it, he says that his only regret in the Borley case is that some university department did not officially take the rectory under its wing and investigate the phenomena independently. Clearly, his thinking is that if there was an independent investigation of the rectory itself, we'd have a better understanding of just what went on there. But I'd argue that despite the masses of contradictions in the story, and despite embellishments and outright lies, we do have a pretty good idea of what went on. The whole thing appears to be a heady mix of local legend, family drama, mass hysteria, and potential hallucinations caused by carbon monoxide from paraffin lamps. Seriously, that's the thing. They think that that's why there were so many ghost stories in the 19th century. Harry Price died just 2 years later, on March 29th, 1948, and whatever you think of him, con artist or one of the most successful paranormal investigators, he was definitely a character like no other, enigmatic and strange in his own way, a somewhat harmless and entertaining flim-flam man, and God knows we all need a bit of escapism from reality now and then. I think there's a rational explanation for almost everything that happened at Borley Rectory. But those rational explanations aren't exciting like murdered nuns and a bunch of ghostly horses trotting around the village at midnight. And there's something deeply fascinating about the haunted house story. Whether you believe in it or not, it appeals to our search for immortality, providing comfort and allowing us to believe that when we depart this mortal coil, there's something waiting for us. The modern world doesn't leave much room for fantastical stories of things that go bump in the night. And while I'm an admitted skeptic, I absolutely love a good ghost story, especially at this time of year when the nights begin to draw in, the flicker of candles from pumpkins light up the street, the wind whistles past your window late at night, and everything feels just a little bit more magical.
Be the season of the wind.